The Spanish Revival mansion, nestled on a quiet Beverly Hills cul-de-sac, had long been a topic of intrigue among locals. Once the home of the legendary Fred Astaire, the property was now owned by a tech entrepreneur named Ellen Reed, who had purchased it with dreams of basking in its Hollywood charm. However, she quickly realized the house offered more than just glamour. It carried an air of inexplicable mystique. Ellen was initially enchanted by the home's polished wooden floors, grand staircase, and a small dance studio Astaire had reportedly used. The room featured floor-to-ceiling mirrors and a vintage phonograph, left behind as an artifact of the star's golden days. She found herself drawn to the studio, often imagining the tap-tap-tap of Astaire's shoes as he rehearsed his flawless routines. It wasn't long before Ellen began noticing strange occurrences. On her second night in the house, she was jolted awake by faint music drifting through the halls. It was an old tune, its melody unmistakably from the 1930s, accompanied by the rhythmic tapping of shoes on wood. Groggy but curious, she ventured toward the sound, her heart racing as she neared the studio. The door was slightly ajar, and the music stopped the moment she stepped inside. The room was empty, the phonograph silent. Convinced it was her imagination, she returned to bed, though sleep eluded her. Weeks passed, and the incidents grew harder to dismiss. Ellen's cleaning staff reported hearing footsteps when no one was home. On one occasion, her dog, Max, began barking furiously at the studio, his fur standing on end. When Ellen investigated, she found a pair of faint scuff marks on the polished floor, marks that hadn't been there earlier. Determined to uncover the truth, Ellen invited a friend, a historian with a penchant for the paranormal, to spend a weekend at the house. Together, they set up cameras and audio recorders, focusing on the dance studio. The first night passed uneventfully, but on the second, they captured something chilling. At precisely 2:15 a.m., the sound of music began soft at first, then unmistakably clear. The rhythmic tapping followed, perfectly in time with the tune. On the video, faint shadows flickered across the mirrored wall, resembling the graceful movements of a dancer. Ellen and her friend were left speechless. The historian theorized that the house had absorbed the energy of Astaire's passion for dance, replaying his routines like a record stuck in time. Ellen, however, wasn't afraid. If anything, she found the phenomena oddly comforting. It was as if the house itself was alive, preserving a piece of Astaire's magic for eternity. To this day, visitors to the house occasionally report hearing those phantom footsteps and snippets of music. Some swear they've seen a figure in the studio's mirrors, a man in a suit and tap shoes, moving with effortless grace. Ellen no longer questions it. If it is Fred, she says with a wry smile, he's welcome to keep dancing. Ellen's fascination with the house deepened as the mysterious occurrences became more frequent. The music and footsteps didn't confine themselves to the dead of night anymore. One afternoon, while hosting a small gathering of friends, the group distinctly heard the faint strains of a piano emanating from the studio. They exchanged uneasy glances, but Ellen, determined to play the gracious host, brushed it off with a joke. Fred must be warming up for his evening performance, she quipped, masking her unease. Her guests chuckled nervously but avoided the studio for the rest of the evening. After they left, Ellen stood outside the studio's door, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She hesitated, her pulse quickening. The faint sound of shuffling feet came from inside. Summoning her courage, she pushed the door open. The studio was empty, bathed in the amber glow of the setting sun. The phonograph sat untouched in the corner, a relic of another time. But Ellen couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She stepped onto the floor, her reflection staring back at her from the mirrors. As she moved toward the phonograph, she froze. There, in the center of the room, was a single footprint on the gleaming surface, distinct, crisp, and unmistakably made by a tap shoe. She crouched to examine it, running her fingers over the imprint. It was as real as the floor beneath her feet. Ellen straightened up, her heart pounding, and turned to leave. But as she reached the door, the phonograph crackled to life. The music that followed was hauntingly familiar, a jaunty tune she had heard in the house many times before. Her breath caught as the sound of footsteps joined the melody, faint but deliberate. They echoed through the room, and in the mirror, she saw it. A shadow moving in perfect rhythm to the beat. It wasn't hers. Ellen's reflection remained rooted in place, but the shadow glided effortlessly across the mirrored wall, twirling and tapping in a mesmerizing routine. She watched, paralyzed, as the figure's movements grew more defined. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a face, sharp features, a confident smile, and eyes alight with the joy of dance. Then the music stopped abruptly, and the shadow vanished. The silence that followed was deafening. Ellen stood there, her mind racing, unable to decide whether to flee or stay. But before she could make a choice, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper filled the room. "Shall we dance?" Ellen stumbled back, her pulse hammering in her ears. The whisper was so close it felt as if the speaker had been right behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty, the mirrors reflecting only her wide-eyed panic. Clutching the doorframe, she forced herself to breathe. Her rational mind screamed that it was impossible, a trick of her imagination. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. This was something real, something beyond explanation. The next few nights brought no relief. The phenomena intensified. Ellen began waking up to faint melodies drifting up the staircase, and more than once, she heard the unmistakable sound of light applause coming from the studio. The footsteps weren't confined to the floor anymore. They seemed to follow her, soft and deliberate, no matter where she went in the house. One night, she decided she couldn't take it anymore. Armed with a bottle of wine and her laptop, she began researching Fred Astaire, poring over old interviews, documentaries, and records of his life. She needed answers, anything to make sense of what was happening. Buried in an obscure forum on Hollywood lore, Ellen found a thread about the house. Several posts recounted the same strange occurrences she was experiencing. One user claimed Astaire had once said the house was his sanctuary, the place where he felt most free to experiment with his art. Another shared a chilling anecdote. In the years after his death, a former caretaker had sworn she heard a man's voice in the studio late at night, humming a tune as if lost in thought. But one post stood out, a cryptic message from an anonymous user. "If you hear the whisper, don't answer it. The moment you do, he'll never stop dancing for you. Ever." Ellen stared at the words, her throat dry. The whisper. Those 3 words played over and over in her head. "Shall we dance?" She hadn't responded. But what if she had? As the hours ticked by, Ellen's unease gave way to determination. If this was Astaire's presence, she had to confront it. To live in fear was unbearable, and she wasn't ready to leave the home she had fallen in love with, no matter how strange its energies were. That night, she returned to the studio with a plan. She had dusted off the phonograph earlier, and now she placed an old record on it, one of Astaire's favorites, Cheek to Cheek. The familiar melody filled the room, the lyrics carrying an otherworldly weight in the stillness. Ellen stepped into the center of the floor, her bare feet making no sound on the polished wood. She stood still, waiting, her breath shallow. The air grew cold. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. And then, as the song swelled, she felt it. A presence, heavy but not hostile, brushing past her like a faint breeze. The mirror flickered. A shadow appeared, its edges sharp and defined, moving in perfect time with the music. The steps were fluid, deliberate, as if the dancer were flesh and blood. Ellen watched, transfixed, as the figure twirled and tapped, the very embodiment of grace. But then, something changed. The shadow's movements slowed, faltered, and for the first time, it turned toward her. Its face, blurred yet unmistakably human, was gazing straight at her. And when it smiled, Ellen's blood turned to ice. "Your turn," the shadow whispered, the words reverberating in her chest. Before she could react, her feet began to move, compelled by an unseen force, carrying her into a dance she hadn't chosen. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Ellen's body moved as though strings were pulling her limbs, her bare feet gliding across the floor with an elegance she didn't possess. The shadow mirrored her movements, its form both solid and ethereal, spinning in tandem with her, as if leading her in an otherworldly waltz. The mirrors reflected the impossible duet, a living woman and a figure born of darkness. The music swelled, faster now, its tempo almost manic. Ellen tried to stop, to break free, but her feet betrayed her, following the rhythm with precision. Her arms arced gracefully, guided by an unseen force. It wasn't painful, it was intoxicating. Her fear blurred into a strange euphoria, a sense of connection to something greater, something alive. But then, as the final notes of the song approached, the air in the room grew heavier, oppressive. The shadow's movements became sharper, almost frantic, its smile twisting into something darker. The mirrors around her began to warp, the reflections rippling as if they were water. The phonograph needle scratched violently, and the music cut out mid-note. Ellen collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, the spell broken. The studio was silent, save for the pounding of her heart. She looked up at the mirrors. Every reflection was still there, but none of them were hers. Instead, the mirrors showed dozens of dancers, their faces pale and strained, moving in eerie unison as if trapped in an eternal performance. Their eyes bore into her, pleading, accusing, desperate. Ellen scrambled to her feet, her mind reeling. The shadow lingered in the center of the room, its form dimming, blending into the dark corners. But before it disappeared entirely, it pointed at her with an unmistakable gesture of invitation. This wasn't over. Ellen fled the studio, slamming the door behind her, but the faint tapping of shoes followed her down the hall. That night, sleep eluded her. The whispers began again, soft at first, then louder, as if coming from every corner of the house. "You've danced with him," they murmured. "Now you're part of the show." Ellen awoke the next morning to find the studio door wide open, the record spinning on the phonograph, though she hadn't touched it. Her reflection in the mirror seemed normal, but when she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of something impossible herself, still standing in the studio, staring back at her with an expression of quiet terror. It wasn't her. And then, behind the other reflection, the shadow returned, its hand extended, waiting for her to take it once more. Ellen slammed the door to the studio and locked it, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the key. But the moment the lock clicked, a low humming began on the other side of the door, soft, melodic, and undeniably human. She staggered backward, the sound burrowing into her mind like an old tune she couldn't forget. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Ellen avoided the studio, keeping the lights on in every room, jumping at the slightest noise. But as evening fell, the house seemed to shift. The air grew dense, and the shadows stretched unnaturally long, pooling in corners where light should have reached. When night came, the house refused to let her rest. The faint strains of music returned, echoing down the hallway like a siren's call. The rhythm was slower this time, deliberate, almost inviting. Ellen sat up in bed, her pulse pounding. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Something or someone wanted her attention. Summoning every ounce of courage, she crept down the hall, stopping just outside the studio. The door stood slightly ajar, the faint golden light spilling out onto the floor. With a deep breath, Ellen pushed it open. The room was empty, but the mirrors were alive. Shadows danced across their surfaces, pairs of figures locked in perfect synchronicity. Men and women in vintage attire twirled and spun, their faces half-formed, flickering like the images on an old reel of film. Ellen's breath caught as she noticed one of the dancers, a woman with her face, her reflection, or the version of herself trapped in the mirror, moved with effortless grace, her expression serene yet distant, as if she were part of something she couldn't escape. The reflection turned, locking eyes with Ellen, and for a fleeting moment, its lips moved, forming a silent word, "Run." But Ellen couldn't move. Her feet were rooted to the spot as the music swelled, louder and more urgent. The mirrors began to vibrate, their surfaces rippling like disturbed water. One by one, the dancers turned toward her, their expressions shifting from joy to something darker, resentment, anger, hunger. The shadow was back, standing in the center of the room, its presence commanding. It raised a hand, beckoning Ellen forward, its fingers curling with an unnatural fluidity. Ellen shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I won't." The shadow tilted its head, as if amused. The music abruptly stopped, replaced by a deep silence that pressed down on her chest. And then, in a voice that seemed to echo from the walls themselves, it spoke. "You already did." Before Ellen could process the words, the floor beneath her feet shifted. It wasn't wood anymore, it felt smooth, cold, like glass. She looked down and gasped. The studio had disappeared. She was standing on a vast reflective surface, endless in all directions, the shadows and dancers surrounding her now more real than ever. The shadow stepped closer, its form solidifying into the faint outline of a man in a sleek suit and tap shoes. He extended his hand to her, his smile both inviting and menacing. "Dance with me again," he said, his voice low and velvety. "Just one more time." Ellen's hand twitched at her side, a part of her inexplicably drawn to him. She clenched her fist, fighting the pull, but the ground beneath her rippled, pushing her closer to the shadow. The dancers around her began clapping in unison, their hollow eyes fixed on her, their movements feverish, urging her to join. And then the whisper came again, close to her ear, soft but insistent. "You can't leave now. Not after the encore." Ellen's heart pounded as the shadow extended its hand closer, the rhythmic clapping of the ghostly dancers building to a fever pitch. The words echoed in her ears, "Not after the encore." Her mind screamed at her to resist, to run, but the room around her seemed to shift, bending reality itself to trap her. She closed her eyes and whispered, "No." The moment the word left her lips, the music stopped. The oppressive silence returned, thick and stifling. When Ellen opened her eyes, the shadow was inches away, its form sharp and defined now, almost human. It tilted its head, studying her with a mix of amusement and disdain. "You think you can refuse me?" it said, its voice cold and mocking. Ellen backed away, but the reflective surface beneath her rippled like liquid, pulling her closer with every step. The dancers in the mirrors leaned toward her, their faces distorted with anguish, their mouths forming soundless pleas. And then she remembered the forum post, "If you hear the whisper, don't answer it." Ellen's mind raced. Had her refusal been a mistake? Or had she already sealed her fate the moment she set foot in the studio? She didn't know. But she did know one thing: she couldn't give in. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "This is my house, my life. You're just a memory. You're not real." The shadow's smile faltered, its form flickering. For a brief moment, the studio seemed to waver, the dancers fading in and out like a corrupted film reel. Ellen pressed on, her voice growing stronger. "You're stuck in the past, Fred. This isn't your stage anymore. Let go." The shadow recoiled as if struck, its outline dissolving into wisps of darkness. The mirrors began to crack, thin lines spreading like spiderwebs across their surfaces. The dancers froze, their forms becoming hazy and indistinct, their clapping fading into nothingness. Ellen's feet finally found solid ground as the reflective surface beneath her turned back into polished wood. The studio was quiet now, bathed in a soft, golden light. She turned to the mirrors, where her own reflection stared back at her, whole and unbroken. But something caught her eye. Just before the cracks in the mirrors sealed completely, she saw him, Fred Astaire, standing tall in the center of the studio. His face was no longer menacing but serene, almost grateful. He tipped his hat to her, a gesture of farewell, and then he was gone. The studio felt different now, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. Ellen stood in the silence, her breathing steadying, the faint scent of old wood and dust filling the air. She walked to the phonograph, its needle resting in place, and turned it off. For the first time in weeks, the house was completely still. Ellen stepped out of the studio, closing the door behind her. She didn't lock it this time, As she turned to leave, she glanced back one last time. Through the crack in the door, she thought she saw a faint shadow dancing in the golden light, twirling in perfect rhythm. She smiled, a bittersweet feeling washing over her. Goodbye, Fred. From that night on, the house remained quiet. The whispers, the music, the footsteps, all of it ceased. Ellen stayed, the studio becoming a place of reflection rather than fear. But sometimes, late at night, she thought she heard the faintest sound of tap shoes echoing in the distance. Not menacing, not haunting, just a memory of a dancer who refused to let the music stop. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.